Hi, you're in Artemis, Apollo's big sister, and we're going to get going here, slightly late, sorry for the wait here, and it's great to see such a big crowd. We're going to be talking about the Artemis project, about how NASA plans to go back to the moon as early as 2024 and land the first woman and the next man on the moon, and hopefully create a permanent, sustained human presence. And we'll also be talking about what other countries are doing in the lunar sphere and what the plans might be for them in the coming decades. So I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves, starting from my far left, please.
My name's Ian Sales. I'm a writer and an SF fan, and I wrote a series of novellas about the Apollo program several years ago.
I'm Becky Chambers. I'm also a science fiction writer. I've recently come out with a novella about astronauts exploring exoplanets. I have no formal STEM training whatsoever, but I am very much an amateur enthusiast, and I do a lot of education outreach in my local community about astronomy in general, but particularly about human spaceflight.
I'm Alan Smale, also a science fiction writer, known mainly there for the Clash of Eagles series, which is alternate history. Roman Empire survives until the 13th century and is now moving into North America. I'm on this panel because I work at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. I'm not in the human spaceflight program, I'm an astrophysicist, but I obviously have a keen interest in everything that's going on with NASA's plans for the future and when we go forward to the moon again and to Mars. Okay.
Yeah, let's do that. I'm Jeffrey Landis. I'm here actually in my guise as being a science fiction writer. I'm mostly a short story writer, although actually I had one novel come out a few years ago. However, in my spare time, I have a day job at the NASA Glenn Research Center, where I develop advanced technologies for future missions. I've been involved with a few Mars missions, not so heavily involved with the moon, but a little bit involved in developing technology for the moon. And actually, I spend much of my time these days working with a group that does advanced concept designs for future spaceflight. So we look at everything from missions to the sun all the way out into missions to the Kuiper Belt. But that includes the moon.
And good morning. I'm Jeanette Epps, and I'm one of the NASA astronauts. And of course, I have an interest in this because we're going to start training and figuring out how to go back to the moon. And I hope to be a part of all those conversations. And I'm happy to be here because we're just getting up to speed, but to talk with some of the experts from the other NASA centers, it's kind of educating me as well. So hopefully I can contribute to the conversation through some of the training that we might do and some of the things that we've been discussing.
Okay, I suspect in this room there are probably a large number of people who know something about the Artemis project, but why don't you give us just a couple of paragraph rundown of what Artemis is and what the various components are?
Okay, so this past July 20th was the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 landing on the moon, and Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. So what the NASA administrator has mandated that by 2024, we're going to go back to the moon, and the new project is going to be called Artemis. Artemis, I think, is in Greek mythology Apollo's twin sister. She's the older one. So it kind of makes sense that we're going to do something bigger. So this time when we go back to the moon, we want to have a sustained presence on the moon. And what that's going to mean is that we're going to need to figure out how to live on the moon, maybe how to excavate. There's a lot of volatiles at the poles on the moon. So how do we take those resources that are on the moon and use them for either fuel, to grow things, for drinking water? So we're figuring out a ton of things. And so this time the project is going to be much bigger. And also the other major part of this is we're going to get more and more commercial entities and hopefully international partners working with us on this. And so I was recently at the NASDAQ, and the CEO of NASDAQ said that the commercial companies that may pop up from an endeavor going back to the moon may generate about $1 trillion in revenue. So it's going to be a huge, a big project to develop a gateway platform, to develop radiation protection for astronauts as we live further and further away from the Earth's surface, to develop habitats that we can build on the moon and leave them there and sustain it. But all of this stuff is so that we can learn how to live on Mars. So everything that we do on the moon will be applied to Mars. You know, one of the things people have constantly asked me is, we've already gone to the moon. We've been there, done that. But what people don't realize is how hard what they did back in the 60s was. It was very difficult what they accomplished. They did put a lot of money towards it and a lot of people towards it. So redoing what they did is going to take us a little time. We're somewhat confident in 2024 because we've really been working on this since 2004. So with that said, that should have generated a lot of questions. So.
Yes, obviously some pieces of this have been in the works for quite some time, and other pieces like the landers, they're just really getting going on the commercial contracts to build and get those in place. So what does the panel in general think about returning to the moon, and what do you think about the timescales involved? NASA has put forward the ambitious plan that we will be aiming to get back there by 2024. And I have a lot of confidence in NASA when it puts its mind to doing these things, and I'm not just saying that because I work there, although all comments are only my own, obviously. So what do people think about the timescales and the obstacles that face us?
Who are you addressing that question to?
I could address it to you if you wish.
Okay. Yeah, what I think is exciting about the moon is the fact that although we went there with the Apollo program 50 years ago, we only explored a relatively small band of the moon. The Apollo program, because of some orbital mechanics of the way they were doing it, was limited to sites relatively near the equator. They couldn't go very far north or south. So there's vast areas of the moon, continent-sized areas of the moon, that are completely unexplored, most notably the North and South Pole. So the part of the Artemis program that I find really exciting is they're aiming for a South Polar site. They're going to look at a site very close to one of the nearly permanently illuminated mountain peaks at the poles of the moon. But what's even more exciting is it's right next to the permanently shadowed craters very close to the South Pole. So that's what I find exciting. What's interesting about that is that comets have brought water and other volatile materials to the moon. Most of this cometary water, it's an airless body with a very low gravity, it evaporates and it leaves. But the part of the cometary volatiles that actually lands in these permanently shadowed craters cools down to temperatures of, about 30 Kelvin, where it becomes just another form of rock. So we're going to a place on the moon that will have water. Completely different from the Apollo landing sites. It's almost as if it were a different landing site. They're doing this actually by picking a completely different method of going to the moon. They're going to make the station called Gateway in a very peculiar orbit. It's in a rectilinear orbit, so it's even hard to describe, but it's an orbit that instead of us going around the equator of the moon, gives you a view of the poles of the moon. So that's what I'm excited about. The timescale is tricky. 2024 is coming right up. But I do have to say that Kennedy said we will go to the moon in 1962. And in 1968, the Apollo 8 mission went into orbit around the moon. So I say, wow, let's do it if we can. Question is, will the politicians be behind it or not? That's to be decided.
Yeah, I have all the faith in the world in NASA's ability to implement this by 2024. I mean, it's got some of the best minds in the world. How could they not? But there is the question of funding. And I hate talking about politics more than just about anything. But it is an unfortunate reality that if you have a government-funded space program or science program of any sort, politics comes into play. And so my one concern with the 2024 is simply, will the money be there? And that does come down to political support. And there has been at least some initial developments that look promising on that front. But that check has yet to clear, is to put it simply. And so, yeah, that comes down to the support of Congress, which ultimately comes down to the support of how many Americans are out there? You guys, because you own NASA. So yeah, I really hope to see it happen, and I really hope that the support is there for it.
Well, Becky just preempted me on one of my points there, but it's not just the funding. I think currently NASA has about 0.5% of the federal budget, and it had closer to 5% during the Apollo program. But one of the things driving the Apollo program was the threat seen by the Soviet space program. And that's dead and gone, the Soviet Union. So we have China, but China's not really seen as a credible threat to the US in space. So there's no political will, as there was during the 1960s, which I think is also an issue. Although I think the plans that they've drawn up, the stack that they're going to build, is really quite exciting.
I think it would be very nice if we just funded things based on the merits of the science.
And the engineering.
And the engineering.
I'm seeing a lot of excitement, actually. I think there is quite a lot of a big head of steam in the country, in the US as a whole, for this at the moment. Recently, we did have the Apollo 50 celebrations, and down on the National Mall, we had this great multimedia presentation where the Washington Monument was illuminated with a big Saturn V going up the side of it. And during the course of the evening, they played a 20-minute video telling the whole story of the Apollo landing on there. And there were big speakers, there were huge speakers, and you could feel your chest vibrate, and all of this kind of stuff. And we now have a new generation of people coming up who are going to be very excited by that kind of thing. And a lot of people were excited there. The people that organized this were expecting, you know, a couple of tens of thousands of people, and they got this immense crowd. The mall was packed all through the weekend to see that. And so I think that is some small sign that people are actually quite enthusiastic about this.
No, I definitely agree. And it's not just the U.S. In other countries that I've visited, so many people all over the world are excited to hear that we're going to go back to the moon, and they want to be a part of it. And I think that's the key thing this time, is that even though we don't have a threat to push us to do this, I think not just that, I guess we sort of have the political will right now to do it, but I think it's more than that, because I think the people, not just in the U.S., all over the world, they're looking forward to something big. They're not sure what it is, but landing on the moon again would be a good start.
Yeah, and this time we're not competing, we're actually looking for international partners to help to come along with us. The space station, which Jeanette obviously knows way more about than I do, is very much an international thing. There are Japanese components, there's obviously a strong Russian component, there are ESA components, and I would imagine that when we return to the moon and go beyond, it's going to be very similar.
I would say I also have encountered a lot of enthusiasm, but I also think there's a definite difference from when I do space talks at, say, a convention, and when I set up, say, tables with my astronomy club downtown in where I live. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm among people who are already on board, who are have already drunk the space Kool-Aid. But I think outside of the space community, I encounter a lot of questions, and they're very fair questions. It's the question of, well, we did this, why are we doing this again? And that's where I think talking about the science behind it is really important. It's not just, we're gonna go stick a flag in it. Like, we're there to do some real work, and that's the sort of thing people do get excited about once you educate them on that.
Well, like Jeffrey was saying earlier, when we went to the moon, we went to 6 different spots. And say if we came, I think Paul Abel, another geologist, told me about this, but he said, if we came to Ireland or wherever you are, and you went to 6 different places in Ireland, could you tell us everything that you know about the Earth then? So now we want to go back and we want to do the real research on the moon that we didn't do before. So we have a huge, I guess it's the lunar, it's called the LEAD group. They put together the science of the moon. And so we want to go back and really figure out what happened to the moon. And a lot of people say that, if we can figure out what happened there, maybe if there's another threat in the future, we can prevent it from happening. So there's a lot of science behind what we want to do on the moon.
I do have to say, though, one of the things that excites me about the idea of the Artemis project is that it's not going to the moon in order to stop at the moon. It's going to the moon as a stepping stone to go further out into the universe. I'm excited about the idea of human trips to Mars. Heck, I'm excited about the future trips out to the moons of Jupiter. I think, why stop at Mars? But the moon isn't the end. The moon should be just our testing ground that we show with the long-duration missions beyond the Earth's magnetosphere, and we show that we have all the technologies, and then we use that once we know how to do the landers and the settlements and the spacesuits and the habitats in orbit. We use that as a jumping off point and go to Mars, and then beyond that to the asteroid belt and outward. So a large part of the excitement about the moon is that it's one small step further out into the solar system.
Okay, so with that, let's talk a little bit more about what other countries are doing with respect to going to the moon with lunar missions from other countries, which is part of our remit. And of course, we've seen quite a lot in the media recently about what other countries have been doing, like China with the Chang'e probe that landed on the far side of the moon, and a lot of us were very, very kind of interested and surprised by that. And the Indians and ESA and Japan and Israel and various other countries are all interested in getting their own piece of the pie, and a lot of these are uncrewed, of course, but they all have their own specific niche, their own specific interests in going back to the moon. So would any of the panel like to talk a little further about that?
I think you'll find the Israeli one was crewed, but they happened to be tardigrades.
Well, okay, they had a really teeny tiny crew of many billion.
So maybe fighting them for space when we get there in order to settle the moon.
I think it's also worth pointing out that the Artemis project does have international support. I believe that ESA is providing the service module for the lander.
For the Orion.
For Orion.
Yeah, the Orion shuttle.
Yeah, and I also read that the Canadian Space Agency was interested in partnering on the Gateway. So this is, it's a NASA project, but as with all things, I think NASA does its best work when it cooperates with the efforts of other countries. So this is already becoming a joint effort.
And despite the fact that one young lady asked about having too many people involved in the project, but I think the way NASA's doing it and doing it in a slow fashion and really methodical way, adding people on as projects come up, and then separate parts like having someone develop a habitat for the surface, having them develop something for excavating the planet and figuring out how to use the natural resources there. I think the way that they're doing it is very, it's a sound way that they're doing it. And you don't have this mentality of too many chefs spoiling the soup. So it really works.
And there's a lot of really cool things you can do, like moving across the lunar surface and essentially sintering the top level, turning it into glass and creating roads to make it easier to move around. There's all of these things that people have been thinking about for many, many years since we went last time. And the pace has never really stopped in the academic circles. There have been conferences every few years talking about when we go back to the moon, what will we do, what's the big science, what's important, where will we go, how will we go there, what will we do when we get there. And a lot of that momentum has been going for some time. A lot of this we've studied in a lot of detail in the intervening decades, and so that's going to hold us in good stead, I think, when we do the return.
But is the science enough to get the dollars out of Trump's grubby little hands?
Is the science enough to get the dollars out of Congress and various other people? Well, our president is obviously keen on things like this happening on his watch, so I think I think there's a fair amount of enthusiasm there. For the rest of Congress, obviously I can't speak for Congress, there are various other priorities that they have and things that they need to consider as they're moving forward. And we do need a fair amount of money to get through the next phase.
Well, actually, we need a very small amount of money by the dollar standards of national budgets.
Well,
you do have to remember that NASA is 0.3% of the budget. But that's always a fair question. The politics is far more complicated than the rocket science. The rocket science part we can do. We can do. The politics part is an interesting question, particularly in that it really is an international politics. It's not just a question of what does the American NASA do, but it's which parts do all of our international partners play? So that's to be determined.
And one of the things I'm hoping, though, is that there will be a lot more commercial entities that get involved. And I think, so not that we want a lot more lobbyists, but, these companies will be invested, and, it would be frowned upon, I guess, if politically things are canceled and they've invested a ton of money in these companies. So one of the end goals, or one of the great things that happened in Apollo, was that there was an investment in developing new companies, and hopefully with Artemis, what ends up happening is we get the commercial entities involved. They develop their companies, which will generate jobs, and then even beyond that, getting Artemis up off the ground, it'll inspire the next generation of scientists and engineers and mathematicians. So to me, Artemis is much bigger than politics in this sense, in that it will impact our economy if they cancel it. It will, even though it still will inspire people to try to keep aiming for the moon, I think it should be politically frowned on to cancel after so many companies have invested in developing items for the moon and develop jobs for the country. That's, I think, the other big part.
So I'm not entirely convinced by reaching out to the commercial sector. What was it John Glenn said when they asked him what it felt like? He was sitting on something built by the lowest bidder. So the commercial sector, that doesn't introduce competition, it introduces profit. So if you look, healthcare is a good example. If you compare healthcare between the UK and the US, where we have the NHS, which has a very low patient cost, to the US, which is pretty much a commercial sector. So I'm not particularly convinced. I think NASA can do it the way it has done it before, providing it has the budget. I'm not sure that actually reaching out to commercial companies and getting them to compete is going to work, especially when you consider that most of the space operators at the moment are all playthings for billionaires who have deep pockets and no voters to worry about.
That's actually completely untrue. The largest space program in the world is not NASA, it's not the Russians, and it's not Elon Musk. The largest space program in the world is the commercial satellite industry, which is huge. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that launches all the time and nobody even notices it. So, in fact, space is commercial. People are making money by the hundreds of millions of dollars in space, and it's getting larger and larger. So don't discount commercial space. Commercial space is a big thing.
Yeah, granted for satellites and low Earth orbits, but
Yep.
I think in reference to traveling further, like to the moon, then there are other considerations that need to be taken into account.
Well, Ian's right. Safety is a big deal, and just bringing in a commercial company. So right now, I think there's a lot of requests for proposals out there, and out to commercial companies. But when they do that, there are safety standards that they're going to have to be held to, because if human beings are going to be put on there. But you're right. It's not a 100% proof venture to bring in commercial. You do want an entity that's doing science for the sake of science and safety behind it, and we can't do it alone. With our budget being 0.03%, you kind of have to have other people invest in it, and hopefully they'll build the economy by generating jobs from it. So you are right, but we have to not take the risk, but we have to manage it and make sure they're doing things safely.
That's actually a real interesting question, and one that needs to be talked about more honestly, is the question of risk versus safety. Apollo program took enormous risks. If you look at what they did, they should have been chewing their fingernails all the time. They were taking such incredible risks. An interesting fact, when John Glenn launched, the first American to go into orbit, he launched on an Atlas rocket. It turns out the Atlas rocket had a history of development. It was developed ever since, I think, first flight around 1956. So there had been many flights on the Atlas rocket. Do you know what the historical success rate of Atlas launches was at the moment that John Glenn launched on it. It had just gotten better than 50%. Half of the Atlas rockets that had been launched when John Glenn launched, the mission failed. So the question is, well, there's a good quote that says, in order to do great things, we need to be able to accept risk. But the question is, how much risk do we accept? If we're doing new things, things that have never been done before, well, maybe we need to take risk. And it's a very, very difficult question. NASA is a very risk-averse agency, because whenever there has been a big public failure, there's tremendous outcry, there's congressional investigations, the program is shut down for 18 months while there's safety reviews and then reviews of the reviews. On the other hand, some of the commercial entities are willing to take great risks. I am in awe of SpaceX and what they've done. But what you forget about SpaceX is they said, we are building a rocket that we're building reliability and it will be reliable from launch one, which blew up. And then they said, oh, we know what went wrong. We're going to fix it. We're going to launch and have our very reliable rocket. And they had their second flight, which blew up. And then they said, well, man, I guess we just really need to stick to it and just keep working on making it more reliability. So they made their third launch, which didn't blow up, but it dunked in the Pacific instead of going into orbit. So their philosophy was, we will take risks, and when something goes wrong, well, we'll fix it and keep on moving. So it's a real question and needs to be addressed. I think, of course, I'm talking about taking risks, and it means I'm risking her life. So I'm going to be sitting working, designing spaceships in my laboratory.
But
and
each
she's
person,
going to be
before they apply to the astronaut program, they have to accept the risks that go along with it. So yes.
So you're okay? You're okay?
Well, we do develop that rapport so that I trust you. Well, you can never say anything's 100%.
Okay. So I apologize in advance.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about Gateway, which is the part that doesn't go down to the moon. This is the orbiting craft that's effectively a space station around the moon that Jeffrey was talking about earlier on. So it's in this very complicated orbit. It's a halo orbit, high eccentricity, goes as close as 600 miles to the moon and as far out as 43,500 miles from the moon. And I actually think that's a pretty interesting project as well. It's not just going around in Earth orbit. It's got this big power to develop new technologies. One of the way that they change the orbit of this is with electron-ion thrusters, which actually don't have a huge amount of power because they don't need a lot of power. They give little nudges and you can change the orbit in that way. And it's also this great orbiting platform similar to the space station for being able to do quite a bit of science and also support the astronauts down on the moon. I'm a little worried about Gateway because people are saying, well, do we really need the Gateway? Can we just cut out that part and have all the rest of it? But I think that the whole package is actually quite compelling. I'd be interested to know what the panel thinks about that.
Well, I think it's really cool. It's a really cool idea. The problem is, though, is keeping it supplied. I mean, we send, monthly, fortnightly missions to the ISS, and that's only, 200 to 400 kilometers away. And we're going to have to do the same there. And even though it's ESA and the Russians and the US supplying the ISS, it's going to be logistically a massive undertaking just to keep the thing up and running.
Aside from the fact that I personally desperately want a moon base to exist, I personally think that Gateway is kind of key to the success of this. In that, first of all, it's just an incredible, it would be an incredible facility for doing science and for making it easy to hop down wherever you like on the lunar surface. It gives you a lot more mobility. From the standpoint of public support, I think that Gateway, in my experience of talking with folks, is what sets Artemis apart from Apollo in people's minds. If you say, oh, we're just going to go land on the moon and we're going to go check out another 6 places or whatever, people don't get excited about that. But when you say, we're going to have an orbital laboratory up there similar to the ISS. We're there to stay. We're going to use it as a jumping off point for other places. That's what people get behind. That's what I get behind. I mean, in my mind, that's that's a breakthrough moment for us. And so for me, I would personally be disappointed, honestly, if the Gateway wasn't part of whatever Artemis turns out to be.
I agree.
Yeah, I'm sort of hard to talk about this because I know so much of the history of Gateway that it's hard to go back. Gateway is an evolution, in fact, of Mars mission proposals. Back after the old Space Exploration Initiative, we did a lot of studies of how to make a mission to Mars. And probably the best of the Mars mission concepts that we came up with use solar electric propulsion, where we have a very large solar array, perhaps a megawatt, that runs an electric propulsion, a high efficiency thruster, to send a cargo mission to Mars, so that when you send the humans, all of the stuff you need to land on Mars is already there in orbit around Mars waiting for you. So we did a lot of studies of the solar electric propulsion Mars mission. Then that was interesting enough that there was then a proposal to do a demonstration of the high power solar electric propulsion system. So we actually went out for bids for the demonstration mission. But at that time, a mission called Asteroid Retrieval popped up. And they said, well, we'll use the solar electric propulsion mission, will in fact be the asteroid retrieval mission. So solar electric propulsion got merged into asteroid retrieval. Asteroid retrieval eventually got canceled, probably for good reasons. It just kept being a more and more sort of useless mission. But the idea of the big solar electric propulsion stage then turned into the Gateway, which is not merely a habitat, it's not merely a space station, but it's actually a space station that has all of the habitation, but also has propulsion. So it can move around, it can adjust its own orbit with the solar electric propulsion. So what I like about Gateway is that it really is the nucleus of a spaceship that would go to Mars. It could be the cargo ship to Mars. It has the large solar electric propulsion, it has the big solar arrays, and the habitat. So it's ready to go. It's almost the Mars spaceship. So that's what I like about it.
Like a space camper van then.
Well, I guess what I want to add is that the other big thing is that if we're going to have a Gateway, and I'm all for a Gateway, they're planning to send astronauts there for like maybe 30 days or so. And you're outside of the Earth's protection when you're there. So now we have to start, we've done all this work in low Earth orbit, and we're within the Earth's protection for radiation. But once we go to the moon and we're on the Gateway, we really have to develop new technologies to protect from radiation. And we need that before we go to Mars. So this whole idea of pushing the science is going to come into play. We're going to have a much larger dose of radiation, and we're going to spend 30 days in that. So a lot of things with radiation, it depends on the time that you spend in the presence of the radiation. So we're just going to have to do more work there, but we definitely need a Gateway platform. I agree.
Okay, we're into our last 10 minutes here, so I'm wondering if we have any questions from the audience that you'd like us to entertain. The first hand I saw was there. There is a microphone being carried to you at this moment.
In terms of supplying the Gateway, is there any thought of making it even minimally self-sustaining? Water recycling, hydroponics, all that good science fiction stuff.
God, I hope so.
Oh, we never even talked about in situ resource or utilization.
Yeah, well,
perhaps.
that's the thing. It's the in situ.
Yes.
We want to try to figure out how to excavate the moon to get the water from there.
Tell them about water recycling in stations.
Yes. So right now we drink each other's pee. So we recycle everything. And there's great systems. We have a Sabatier system. We have an oxygen generation system. So all of the systems that we're doing now on the International Space Station will definitely apply to the Gateway. But eventually, the in situ resources that we can gather, that's going to be the next source of research, and hopefully even beyond that. Maybe like the scintillation of the roads to make glass roads and make traveling easier. So there's a lot more. I think the Gateway is going to be a second International Space Station.
And the whole reason we're so interested in the ice on the moon is as a resource in space that we can use for future settlements. So yeah, we're really interested in that.
Okay. 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. Over there, perhaps?
Will there be a constant human presence on Gateway as there is with the ISS? Because that'd be cool.
That is definitely the plan, because we're going from low Earth orbit to, and everything that we learn there, we have to apply it to the moon. And so with the International Space Station, we weren't sure how the human body would respond to staying 2 months. And then we feel, oh, okay, that worked. Then we went to 3 months. And now we're up to 6 months. And we even had the 1 year, 340-day stay on the International Space Station. So we're learning tons of how the body adapts, and we're developing countermeasures. So the next goal of take everything we did in low Earth orbit, get out of the protection of the Earth's magnetosphere, and apply it to the moon. So yeah, there's going to be a lot more research that we have to do, but we want to have a sustained presence there.
Okay, let's go back a bit. So take a hand from back there.
How many years might it take to go from building out a moon base using supplies brought from Earth, ferried in and pre-made, to going to building out the established moon base using resources from the moon itself, like developing a factory or something to build the pieces to expand the moon base?
I suspect it would take a considerable amount of time, because you actually do need some fairly heavy machinery on the moon to be able to do this kind of resource extraction. If you're trying to pull out metals from the moon, or pull out the water and break it down into hydrogen and oxygen. And of course, any facility you send there, it's going to the poles, it's going to an area that is naturally colder. So you're going to have this factory that is working at very cold temperatures, but also needs to maintain high temperatures to break down the hydrogen and oxygen. Then you need to store it cryogenically and for it to be super cooled. There's all of these various stages of things you have to do to actually do the resource extraction and to use it effectively. That's going to take a lot of mass on the moon to start with. So I think I'm not sure I can put a year mark on that, but it's certainly going to take a lot of time and a lot of steps forward.
It happens in stages. Some things are easier than others. The thing that most people are focused on actually is making rocket propellant on the moon, because you tend to think about the hardware that gets landed on the moon, but tend to forget that everything that lands and takes off on the moon uses more than its own mass of propellant. So if you're putting 1 ton on the moon, you need several tons of propellant to be made. So that's the very first object, and then it sort of ramps up. The easy thing is to use, as you were mentioning, regolith. You can sinter regolith to make bricks, to make blocks, and then you can start moving to farther and farther, more complicated things. When you're talking about making, for example, high-tech components, integrated circuits, well, that'll be pretty far down the road. An integrated circuit plant is pretty big and complicated, and that's not going to happen in the near term. So it starts with the simplest things and then moves progressively on and on to the more complicated things that you can make in space.
3D printers.
Okay, right at the front here.
Right. What are the leading methods being considered for radiation protection on Gateway? Because obviously that's got to be solved before you can have people there long term. I mean, like 10 Tesla magnetic field over a huge volume, or what?
Well, I do know that they're we do have materials on the International Space Station that do provide a little bit of protection for the astronauts now. And most of those have water molecules in them. So it's water, basically, that we use for protection. I've even saw an Israeli vest that has, so I wasn't sure if it's the larger water clusters or just water molecules in it, a polymer. So it's some type of polymer that provides a certain amount of protection. But these are the things we're investigating now. And so there's a lot of research going on how we protect outside of the Earth's protection, and what we're going to see when we're at the moon. On the EFT test that we did on the first Orion, it was just the vessel. There was a radiation detection, and there were other things that were on there to give us a little data. But the amount of radiation that the astronauts will sustain, it would depend on the amount of time that they spend there too. So we got to figure out how much protection is needed on the outside structure of the space, of the gateway, how much the suits itself, that whatever they wear, even the garments that they're wearing. It is a difficult question, a very difficult question, but that is what people are working on as we speak.
But in space, P has many uses.
Yes, it can protect you from radiation, for sure.
It might be worth noticing that there's different types of radiation.
Yeah.
One type of radiation is the coronal mass ejections that sometimes happen in conjunction with the solar flare in the sun. And this is the part where there's a flare in the sun, it releases a massive cloud of high energy protons that several minutes later come past the Earth. And if you were exposed unprotected to the protons from a coronal mass ejection, it would give you a deadly dose of radiation. But the thing about solar coronal mass ejections is you do see them coming. You have warning, and they only last, the high radiation part is only a few hours. The dangerous part is perhaps a day. So for protecting against coronal mass ejection, you could hide. You could find the small part of the station that's protected, surrounded by water, and wait out the solar storm. It would be a day or so. For the very long term, however, there's another type of radiation, the galactic cosmic rays that come from thousands of light years away at very high energy. Protecting against galactic cosmic rays is a much, much harder question, and people don't even know the effect of long-term exposure to galactic cosmic rays. We know short-term exposure doesn't kill you. You don't die for a week of exposure. So, but the long-term, well, that may need the magnetic shielding that you're talking about.
Even currently now, when we have a solar flare, the astronauts go shelter in place in their crew quarters because it has additional protection. So it is a big problem, but you know, a lot of the astronauts who come back home, you don't find these high rates of cancer due to that. So it does depend on how much time are you spending in the presence of a particular type of radiation.
Okay, I suspect we could go on for at least another hour on this topic, but I've just been given the stop sign, so I'd like to thank you all very much for coming, and have a great day.